What do you know about Brazil? Other than being famous for football and beaches and the massive Amazon rainforest, most people don't know much more about the country of Brazil. Well, that's the impression we're here to change. In this video, we will go over why Brazil is so much more than all of this. Let's get into it. Brazil is a federative state with the union, federal states, and municipalities serving as its three tiers of federated units. All three are autonomous at the federal level, maintaining representatives of the legislative and executive branches, and have parallel roles in implementing public policy, or housing provision, for instance. There are 27 states, 5,570 municipalities, and the federal district, where the nation's capital, Brasilia, is located. In addition to the union, the population and size of the municipalities is incredibly varied. In terms of population, São Paulo, the largest municipality in the nation, had 11.9 million residents in 2014. The smallest municipality in the nation, Bora, had 835 residents in the same year. In the federal state of Pará, the municipality of Altamira covers nearly 160,000 square kilometers, which is almost 4 times the area of the Netherlands. The planning has not always been good. Initially, it did not take into account the significant material disparity that exists across municipalities through the nation. The majority of planning expertise actually resides at the local level, although municipalities in Brazil have significantly varying levels of planning proficiency. While municipalities are most suited for traditional spatial planning, the federal government and the federal states are nonetheless also capable of planning. The federal government has made the following initiatives in the field of spatial planning: strategic big infrastructure development and management with potential for regional influence, meaning ports, highways, airports, and large water dams for electricity generation, have been prioritized and offered incentives. One illustration is the megaport of Suju da Barra, Brazil's largest port, and the highway to China, a project of the federal government to assist the export of iron ore and other commodities. A special status is given to some cities or regions in conjunction with the development of infrastructure and the implementation of particular spatial policies, as is the case with the free economic zones of Manaus in the Amazon, Sorriso in Mato Grosso, and São Borja in Rio Grande do Sul, as well as the industrial poles of Camaçari in Bahia, Resende in Rio de Janeiro, and Suape in Pernambuco. Though tax incentives for exporting businesses and sectors, the free economic zones, also known as Zones for Exports Processing, ZPE is the Brazilian acronym, aim to hasten regional growth. The Ministry of Planning, Budget, and Management is in charge of coordinating these policies, which have been approved by the Federal State Commission on Economic Issues, or CAE. Federal policy objectives have changed significantly over time, but they have historically been linked to initiatives to support national integration, the term the federal government uses to denote territorial coherence and governability, and to promote development in the vast, underdeveloped Brazilian hinterland. As early as the 19th century, this led to the creation of new towns. There are numerous examples that span more than a century, with Brasilia, 1960, and its numerous satellite cities being the most well-known. Teresina was established in 1842. Belo Horizonte was established in 1897, Londrina in 1934, Goiânia in 1942, Boa Vista in 1944, Marinja in 1947, and Palmas in 1947 all came into being after Petrópolis in 1990. An example of a contemporary new town is Palmas, which was planned and built as a result of administrative reform on the adoption of the new constitution in 1988. After the enormous and largely desolate state of Goiás was divided in two, Palmas was built to act as the administrative center of the newly formed state of Tocantins. The idea was supported by federal financing. The goal of this persistent program of hinterland colonization was to counter the legacy of the nation's economic and population concentration in its coastal regions. This legacy was the product of Portuguese colonization's mercantile logic, which required crops to be grown close to the coast for shipment to Europe. Following independence in 1822, successive federal governments followed an integration program. The military's regime establishment of economic development agencies in order to spur growth in the nation's underdeveloped north and northeastern regions was also inspired by this integration policy. Recently, the focus has switched to encouraging strategic decentralization of consumption and production and supporting operations relating to exporting sectors or free economic zones, new ports, and highways. Federal states have a significant influence on regional infrastructure development, which they accomplish through big infrastructure projects rather than through policy. The need to coordinate the construction of a significant transportation infrastructure and manage water resources has also resulted in the emergence of some form of integrated metropolitan spatial management around Brazilian metropoles. However, there are still issues with good regional and urban planning in the nation. Metropolitan regions could only be created lawfully by the Union prior to the 1988 Constitution's adoption. 9 metropolitan regions, Belo Horizonte, Belém, Curitiba, Fortaleza, Porto Alegre, Recife, Salvador, São Paulo, and Rio de Janeiro, were formally constituted between 1973 and 1974. After 1988, federal states were in charge of designating cities or clusters of cities as metropolitan areas. Currently, there are 3 integrated development regions and 51 metropolitan areas, or RIDES, in the Portuguese acronym. Articulate and synchronize policy measures by the Union, federal states, and municipalities for the promotion of projects that encourage economic growth and provision of infrastructure necessary for development at the regional scale is the stated goal of RIDEs. According to the Federal Constitution of 1988, metropolitan regions are made up of neighboring municipalities that must coordinate their efforts to integrate public services in order to address issues like mobility and sanitation. However, there are issues caused by the lack of uniform standards because the technical and topographical requirements for the development of metropolitan regions vary from state to state. Some states have multiple metropolitan areas, such as Santa Catarina, whereas others only have one municipality per metropolitan area, like Manaus, the city capital of the state of Amazonas. In the case of the metropolitan area of São Paulo, there are 39 municipalities that make up metropolitan regions. Instead of functioning planning or territorial subdivisions, metropolitan areas have a legal definition. Conflicts of interest between municipalities within the same metropolitan area are not unheard of, and municipalities are not required to align their policies with metropolitan policy. The implementation of cooperative actions and investments has frequently been hampered by differences in population sizes and resources, political allegiance, and other aspects. What little progress there is in metropolitan integration is accomplished through infrastructure built by the federal states. But the financial crisis that federal states went through in the 1980s and 1990s has hampered their efforts to advance unified urban governance. Since the introduction of river basin committees as integrative institutions for policymaking in the wake of the federal government's 1997 Law of Waters, issues related to regional resource management, particularly water resource management, have drawn increased attention. River basin committees are multi-stakeholder forums responsible for deciding on policies for river basins, which frequently include several municipalities. They are modeled after the committees that were established in Europe and have the same goal. However, there is a lack of coordination between river basin committees and other organizations responsible for planning regional infrastructure, and planning ambitions are often unclear. Brazilian cities got a significant amount of federal funding between 2004 and 2014, primarily through federal development programs. The PAC, or Programa de Acceleração de Crescimento, and the hotly contested Programa Minha Casa Minha Vida are 2 of these initiatives, or My House, My Life housing program. The PAC's goals for 2007 were to raise economic growth rates, expand employment and household revenue, eliminate social and regional imbalances, and maintain the pillars of the Brazilian economy, meaning low inflation, budgetary soundness, and external accounts. Massive infrastructure plans for electricity, sanitization, housing, metro systems, and water resources were to be funded by PACs. Although the ability of local governments to plan has improved thanks to the transfer of federal money to municipalities, the federal government's ability to sway local development has also grown. Due to the urgency of infrastructure development, the transfer of federal money was tied to the availability of local project approvals. In other words, money would be provided even if projects weren't a crucial component of a local strategic plan. This has, naturally, encouraged fragmented and frequently unsustainable urban expansion, often at the expense of municipal planning regulations. Nevertheless, more substantial spatial planning occurs at the local level in municipalities. This is largely due to the liberal 1988 federal constitution, which was adopted soon after the nation ended a 21-year military dictatorship from 1964 to 1985. Devolution and participation have been made a priority in Brazil's urban development, not just in theory but also in practice, albeit with mixed results thanks to the 1988 Constitution. We will discuss the effects of the 1988 Constitution and its 2001 offshoot, the City Statute, in the section that follows. Brazil ended its 21-year military dictatorship in 1985. The military encouraged a coup in 1964 against the Social Democrat president João Goulart, who had been elected freely. The coup took place in the middle of a campaign of defamation against Goulart, who was suspected of being a Marxist who wanted to collectivize the economy in Brazil. This took place during the Cold War and during a time when social justice discourse was highly sensitive. As a result, democratic institutions broke down attempts at redistributive policies of all kinds, including those related to spatial development that even vaguely resembled redistributive spatial planning, were abandoned. As a result, social inequality in the nation increased. From the 1950s to the 1980s, Brazil urbanized at historic rates, and millions of dispossessed rural residents moved to large Brazilian cities in the quest of the modernity's promises of greater access to services, employment opportunities, and improved life prospects. One of the biggest exoduses in human history occurred in the decades following World War II, albeit it is poorly remembered outside of Brazil. Countless numbers of poor peasants fled rural Brazil and moved towards the southeast's quickly industrializing towns. This is primarily due to droughts and inundations, land grabs, and limited chances in rural areas, according to Fischlowitz and Engel, 1969. Between 1960 and 1990, around 8.1 million individuals moved from the northeast region and 3.8 million departed from the state of Minas Gerais in direction of cities in the southeast, according to Brito and Carvalho, 2006. Even more startling statistics about urbanization, or migration plus natural growth, can be found. Brazil's urban population increased from 31 million in 1960 to 137 million in 2000, which meant that in less than 2 generations, more than 100 million new urban residents needed to be housed, nourished, and employed. Migrants sought inclusion in modernity as they fled rural areas where many of them lived in abject poverty. All of the major Brazilian cities saw explosive population growth over a short period of time. The extreme poverty of the peasant population exacerbated this rural exodus, which is the largest of its kind in all of Latin America. This process was fostered by rapid population increase, agricultural modernization, and the resulting decline in employment prospects for farm workers. The absence of infrastructure and impossibility of purchasing a parcel of land in rural areas made the situation worse in the 1980s. The creation of capital-rich agricultural firms exacerbated the gap between large landowners and peasant farmers who focused on subsistence farming. At a time when planning capabilities were drastically diminished and public administration and accountability were all but non-existent, millions of poor peasants fled to Brazil's quickly industrializing cities. Because of this environment of rapid growth, rural flight, and inadequate governance, along with a specific ideological and political background, the public sector's ability and inclination to plan properly was minimal. More specifically, this exceptional movement of urban to rural migration, combined with poor governance, has produced exceptional urban typologies linked to informality and self-help. Favelas, or slums, corticos, or crowded tenant houses, and lotejamentos irregulares, or informal allotments, are a few of these typologies. All of these typologies have one thing in common. They are shaky urban forms of habitation developed by unimportant private investors who produce illegal substitutes to meet the needs of the most vulnerable. Because they developed in a specific historical, economic, and geographic context, favelas are a special urban typology that cannot be accurately represented by the English term slums. Favelas are areas where residents have constructed their own homes using affordable materials in an entirely haphazard manner, frequently on public property that has been invaded. As a result, there is a cacophony of unfinished homes and interstitial spaces that are either poorly or completely unserved by infrastructure and urban services. Favelas, for example, cover a total of 24 square kilometers in the city of São Paulo. 88.6% of all subnormal housing in Brazil, including São Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, and Belém, is concentrated in 20 urban centers across the nation, according to an IBGE research. Together, these three cities account for 43.7% of all squalid housing in the nation. This stands in stark contrast to the community's economic viability. In 2009, 5 municipalities, São Paulo at 12%, Rio de Janeiro at 5.4%, Brasília at 4.1%, Curitiba at 1.4%, and Belo Horizonte at 1.4%, accounted for around 25% of total income generation in the nation. The unprecedented process of human migration in the middle of the 20th century, combined with inadequate planning capabilities and ideological opposition to redistributive plans, led to the creation of cities where social inequality, illegal settlements, and a lack of adequate housing, environmental dangers, and traffic jams are commonplace. Cities in Brazil are created in large positions at a time without following plans or norms. This is what Brazilians refer to as the clandestine city. Self-help construction has been mostly used to build this covert city. Brazil's urbanization project had practically run its course by the end of the 1990s. The country's urbanization rate increased dramatically from 31.24% in 1940 to 87% in 2010. Nowhere was this urbanization more rapid than in São Paulo, where the population increased from 1.3 million immediately before World War II to 11.2 million in 2011, with an additional 9 million in the metropolitan region, which had over 20.3 million people in 2011. During the military regime, grassroots social groups calling for democratic change initially appeared in the city of São Paulo. According to Holston and others, the formation of democratic social movements that influenced institutions shortly following re-democratization in 1985 is closely related to the process of urbanization in São Paulo. The struggle for the right to the city, which includes the freedom to shape the city to one's needs and desires, as well as the freedom to live there, or first as undocumented settlers and then as full citizens living under the rule of law, was a major factor in the enactment of the 1988 Constitution. Brazil's new democratic constitution was drafted between 1986 and 1988, which was a critical period. By personally petitioning MPs and collecting signatures for the popular amendments, popular social movements and civic groups were able to change the Constitution's wording or amendments to the text proposed by popular consultation. As we noted, these social movements paradoxically arose under military control as a result of informal urbanization, the difficult integration and formerly disenfranchised residents into the city, and the upholding of the law. Urban social movements now have a voice and can take part in municipal governments and urban planning thanks to the 1988 Constitution. Through participatory procedures, citizens would now be able to affect municipal ordinances and regulations and master plans. This is significant because it has the potential to close the gap between policy formulation and actual execution, closing the gap between formal planning and unofficial urbanization. As we shall show, participatory tools would not be sufficient to alter the institutional culture of planning, and spatial planning has retained much of its historical technical conceit and dedication to serving the interests of economically dominant groups. However, the country's spatial planning techniques and the role that planners play have undergone a fundamental change as a result of the new constitution. Brazil is not far from complete service provision. If we examine the coverage of fundamental public services in normal and subnormal families of the three largest Brazilian cities, Please tell us in the comments section what are your thoughts on Brazil after all this new information. Please give us a thumbs up, share the video, and subscribe to our channel if you enjoyed it. To ensure that you never miss another one of our intriguing videos like this, click the bell button below.